The wind carried a whisper that shouldn't exist on an uninhabited island. I froze in place, my flashlight beam trembling across the dense foliage as something rustled just beyond its reach. A distant sound like someone calling my name drifted through the midnight air, yet I was miles from civilization, alone on this expedition. At least, I was supposed to be alone. I came to Blackrock Island as a marine biologist specializing in isolated ecosystems. The university had approved my 6-week research grant, and I'd been thrilled at the prospect of documenting the unique marine life around this remote Pacific atoll. My colleagues had joked about my upcoming vacation, but I was ready for the solitude. The island had been uninhabited for decades, supposedly since the 1940s, when a small research station was abandoned for reasons poorly documented in the university archives. Thought my camp was simple, but effective: a reinforced tent positioned on the Fay Eastern Beach, solar panels for my equipment, and a satellite phone for weekly check-ins with the mainland. The island itself was small, barely 3 miles across, dominated by a dormant volcanic formation at its center. Dense jungle vegetation covered most of the terrain, with a rocky coastline interrupted by only a few sandy beaches. The first 4 days had been productive and peaceful as I documented the rich marine biodiversity in the surrounding reefs. The trouble began on the 5th night. I was cataloging specimens in my tent when the satellite phone rang. This was unusual. My scheduled call wasn't for another 2 days. When I answered, there was only static punctuated by what sounded like distant, muffled voices. I attributed it to atmospheric interference and went back to work. It was only later, reviewing my journal, that I realized no one should have had reason to call me off schedule, and the satellite phone displayed no record of an incoming call. I told myself it must have been a dream, that I dozed off at my workstation. The isolation was playing tricks on my mind. Yet, the next morning, I found my carefully organized equipment had been rearranged specimen containers clustered together. My camera moved from where I always kept it. Nothing was missing, just different. Each item shifted by mere inches, but enough that I noticed. Perhaps I had moved them myself, forgetting in the haze of exhaustion from long days of fieldwork. On the 6th day, I hiked inland to document the island's interior plant life. The jungle was thicker than expected, humid and alive with insects. Around midday, I stumbled upon what remained of the old research station, a concrete foundation reclaimed by vegetation, rusty equipment scattered about. According to my map, this structure should have been on the western side of the island, yet here it was, nearly a mile from its documented location. Maps could be wrong, I reasoned, especially of such an isolated place. Still, something about the abandoned station unsettled me. The vegetation surrounding it seemed different, darker, more twisted than the rest of the island's flora. Near the old building, I found a metal box partially buried in the soil. Inside was a journal, its pages yellowed and warped by humidity. Most entries were too faded to read, but a few fragments remained legible. One passage caught my attention. Day 47. The sounds continue at night. Henderson thinks we should leave, but the specimens need more time. The movement in the water isn't consistent with any known marine species. Something about this island isn't right. I returned to my camp before sunset, unsettled but eager to document my findings. That night, I woke to the sound of something moving around my tent. Heavy footsteps circled slowly, pausing occasionally. My flashlight revealed nothing when I shone it through the tent material, but the footsteps continued, methodical and deliberate. I called out, thinking perhaps another researcher had arrived unannounced, but received no response except the sudden stillness of the footsteps. When I finally gathered the courage to unzip the tent and look outside, the beach was empty. The only marks in the sand were my own from earlier in the day. The following morning, I found new arrangements in my camp, my specimens now organized by something other than my classification system. My journal opened to a blank page with my pen placed neatly beside it. I checked the satellite phone and found the signal unusually strong. I called my university contact, but the call wouldn't connect. Instead, I heard what sounded like a recording of my own voice from the previous day when I had been dictating notes. I hadn't used the phone for recording. I decided to investigate the old research station more thoroughly. The jungle seemed to resist my progress, vines catching at my ankles, branches diverting my planned route. It took nearly 3 hours to cover what should have been a 40-minute walk. When I arrived, the station had changed. The partial walls were now more intact, some equipment less rusted than I remembered. Inside what must have been the main laboratory, I found intact specimen jars containing unidentifiable marine organisms, preserved in a clear liquid that hadn't evaporated despite the broken seals on the containers. One jar contained something that resembled a fragment of coral, but it seemed to shift position when not directly observed. A logbook on a nearby desk contained entries dated just 3 weeks prior, impossible since the station had been abandoned for over 70 years. The handwriting in the recent entries matched that of the decades-old journal I had found. The final entry reads simply, "They're coming through." I photographed everything, though my camera battery drained unusually quickly. As I prepared to leave, I noticed a small tidal pool near the station that I hadn't seen on my previous visit. The water was unnaturally clear and still, despite its connection to the ocean. Leaning over to examine it, I saw my reflection waver and distort. For a brief moment, another face seemed to overlay mine, gaunt, with eyes too wide and skin too pale. I recoiled and the image disappeared. The jungle seemed different on my return, journey paths appearing where none had been before, leading me in circles. The normally bright daylight dimmed under the canopy, though my watch indicated it was only mid-afternoon. When I finally reached my camp, I found footprints around my tent. Not my own hiking boots, but bare footprints with elongated toes. They led from the water's edge to my camp and back again. That night, the island came alive with sounds, whispers just beyond comprehension, movement in the vegetation surrounding my camp, and something large disturbing the water offshore. My flashlight batteries failed simultaneously, leaving me in darkness except for the blue glow of my laptop screen. I tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's findings, but the images on my camera had corrupted each photograph of the research station. Now showed just empty jungle, except for one. The final image displayed a figure standing in the doorway of the laboratory, indistinct but unmistakably watching the camera. I had taken these photos alone. I decided to leave first thing in the morning. The research wasn't worth whatever was happening. I attempted to send an emergency message through my satellite connection, but received an automated response. Signal blocked, local interference. Service unavailable until interference source removed. The message appeared in an old-fashioned font I didn't recognize from any modern operating system. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by sounds I couldn't identify, something scuttling across the roof of my tent, whispers that seemed to come from inside my own head, and once the distinct sound of someone typing on a keyboard, though my laptop was powered down. I awoke fully to the sound of waves, stronger than they should have been on this sheltered side of the island. Dawn revealed the ocean churning unnaturally, waves moving in circular patterns rather than toward the shore. As I packed my essential equipment, I noticed something had been written in the wet sand near my tent, symbols I didn't recognize, arranged in concentric circles. They seemed to shimmer in the morning light, some appearing to float slightly above the surface of the sand. I photographed them before the tide washed them away, but when I checked the image, the camera showed only undisturbed beach. My satellite phone rang as I finished packing. When I answered, I heard my own voice, speaking words I hadn't said. Day 12. The specimens show unusual properties. I've decided to extend my stay indefinitely. The university will understand once they see what I've discovered. The call disconnected before I could respond. Checking the phone's log, there was no record of an incoming call. I launched my small boat and headed toward the open ocean, keeping my eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to look back at the island. The engine struggled more than it should have with the calm waters. After 20 minutes, I realized the island hadn't receded. It remained the same distance behind me despite my progress. Another hour of travel yielded the same result. No matter which direction I turned, the island remained directly behind me, unchanged in size and distance. Eventually, fuel concerns forced me to return to shore. As I approached, I noticed new structures along the beach equipment I hadn't set up, another tent beside my own. Landing the boat, I cautiously approached the new camp. Everything was arranged exactly as I would have done it, down to the specific placement of research tools. Inside the second tent was a sleeping bag identical to mine, and a journal filled with entries in my handwriting, detailing discoveries I hadn't yet made. The last page contained a single line. I've been on this island for 6 months now, though it was supposed to be a 6-week expedition. I'm Noel. A noise from the jungle's edge drew my attention, footsteps approaching slowly. I turned to see a figure emerge from the dense vegetation. The individual moved with an unnatural gait, their features obscured by shadow despite the bright daylight. As they stepped onto the beach, I recognized the university insignia on their weathered jacket. The figure raised its head, and I found myself staring at my own face gaunt, weathered, with eyes that had seen too much. The doppelganger smiled in recognition. "You finally arrived," my own voice said from its mouth. "I've been waiting for you to join us." The island has been waiting too. Behind my duplicate, more figures began emerging from the jungle, each wearing the same research uniform from different eras, each with faces that seemed almost human but not quite. Some carried specimen jars containing fragmented pieces that resembled both coral and human features. The tide began to rise unnaturally fast behind me, cutting off any escape by water. My doppelganger reached out a hand. "Don't worry," it said, its voice overlapping with others that shouldn't exist. "The research is important. The specimens need more time. You'll understand soon enough." The creatures, the others, moved toward me in perfect unison, and somewhere, in the depths of the island, something massive stirred awake. I realized then that I wasn't the first researcher to come to Blackrock Island. And like the others before me, I wouldn't be the last. The island would make sure of that. The next day started with profound disorientation. I woke not on the beach where my confrontation with the doppelgangers had occurred, but back in my tent as if nothing had happened. My equipment remained exactly as I had organized it initially, with no sign of disturbance. The second camp, the figures from the jungle all gone. For a brief, hopeful moment, I considered that the entire experience might have been an elaborate nightmare brought on by isolation and research stress. This relief evaporated when I stepped outside and found the beach pristine to pristine. The footprints I'd made yesterday had vanished, and more disturbingly, so had my boat. Where I had securely anchored it the day before was now empty shoreline, the sand undisturbed as if no boat had ever been there. My satellite phone showed no signal, not even the interference message from before. The device was completely functional but connected to nothing. I spent the morning searching the island's perimeter for my missing boat. The coastline seemed longer than it should have been for an island this size. After 4 hours of walking, I still hadn't completed a full circuit. Landmarks I passed seemed to repeat themselves with subtle differences. A distinctive rock formation appeared multiple times, each iteration slightly altered in its configuration. Around midday, I discovered a small inlet I hadn't noticed before. Partially concealed by overhanging vegetation was a wooden dock, weathered but sturdy, that had clearly been maintained. Tied to it was an old rowboat, its paint peeling but otherwise sound. Near the dock stood a small shack built from salvaged materials, some of which appeared to be parts of my missing boat. Inside the shack, I found crude living quarters, a bed made from canvas and driftwood, shelves holding preserved food in jars, and a desk covered with maps and journals. The map showed Blackrock Island, but with configurations I didn't recognize, coastlines that shifted between drawings, landmarks that moved position. One map was dated 1879, another 1923, and a third bore yesterday's date. All were drawn in different hands, but showed the same impossible geography, an island that seemed to exist in multiple layouts simultaneously. The journals were equally disturbing. Each appeared to be written by a different researcher, spanning decades, yet all describing similar experiences, arriving for legitimate scientific purposes, encountering anomalies, finding evidence of previous expeditions that shouldn't exist, and gradually discovering the island's resistance to being left. The most recent journal contained an entry written in handwriting identical to mine, describing discoveries I had yet to make. I backed out of the shack, fighting rising panic. The sun had shifted position drastically. It was now late afternoon, though I'd entered the shack just after noon. More concerning, the rowboat that had been secured to the dock was now gone, with no indication it had broken free naturally. In its place floated a piece of driftwood with symbols carved into its surface. The same unrecognizable writing I'd seen in the sand dot. As I made my way back toward my camp, I noticed changes in the island's interior. Paths had appeared where there had been only dense vegetation before, leading toward the central volcanic formation. The old research station I'd found earlier now appeared to be in a different location entirely, more intact than on my previous visit. Smoke rose from a chimney that hadn't existed before. I approached cautiously, expecting to find my doppelganger or the other entities I'd encountered. Instead, I found Dr. Martin Henderson, the lead researcher of the original expedition from the 1940s, whose name I'd read in the university archives. He appeared exactly as he did in the single photograph I'd seen of him before my trip, down to the distinctive scar along his jawline. He looked up from his work as I entered, unsurprised by my presence. "You're earlier than expected," he said, calmly, as if we'd had a meeting scheduled. "The others usually take longer to find their way here." When I asked how he could possibly be alive and unaged after 80 years, he laughed a sound that seemed to echo more than it should have been. "The confined space. Time works differently here," he explained, motioning for me to sit across from him. "The island exists in multiple periods simultaneously. Those of us who came for research never really leave. We just continue our work in different streams of the island's existence." He showed me his findings, detailed documentation of marine organisms that defied classification, physical properties that shifted under observation, and environmental conditions that should have been impossible. According to Henderson, the island itself was some kind of biological entity, one that existed partially outside conventional reality. "The reef around the island isn't coral," he explained. "It's part of a larger organism, a living thing that creates pockets of distorted reality. We're not just on an island. We're inside something that's studying us as much as we're studying it." Before I could ask more questions, Henderson looked toward the window with sudden alarm. The light had changed, taking on a greenish hue that made his features appear corpse-like. "It's happening again," he whispered. "You should leave now. When it feeds, it's dangerous to be near the access points." I fled the station as the ground began to tremble. The jungle around me shifted visibly, trees bending in impossible directions, paths rearranging themselves. I heard Henderson's voice call out behind me, though it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Follow the water's edge back to your time. Don't look at the reflections. The journey back to my camp became nightmarish. Vegetation grew before my eyes, blocking paths moments after I passed through them. The sky darkened prematurely, and the sounds of the jungle were replaced by something like whispered conversations in languages I couldn't identify. When I finally broke through to the beach, the ocean was unnaturally still, its surface reflective as glass. Despite the strengthening wind, my camp appeared untouched, but something was different. My equipment had been used data entries made on my laptop that I hadn't recorded, specimens collected and labeled in my handwriting with dates I hadn't experienced yet. Most disturbing was my journal, which now contained a detailed account of conversations with Henderson that had apparently occurred over several weeks, though I'd just met him hours ago. The satellite phone rang as night fell. When I answered, I heard multiple voices overlapping my own, Henderson's, and others I didn't recognize, all speaking fragments of research notes and distress calls. Before disconnecting, a single clear message came through. The island doesn't let researchers leave until they're replaced. Someone else has to come. That night, a violent storm arose without warning. Wind and rain lashed my tent as powerful waves eroded the beach mere feet from where I sheltered. Through the chaos, I saw lights offshore, a boat approaching despite the impossible conditions. As lightning flashed, I glimpsed its outline and recognized the university's research vessel, the one scheduled to retrieve me at the end of my 6-week stay. My relief turned to horror as I realized only 3 weeks had passed since my arrival. Not 6. The boat shouldn't be here yet. As it drew closer, I could make out figures on deck, academic colleagues I recognized, coming to collect samples and documentation. Coming to replace me. In that moment, understanding crashed over me with sickening clarity. The island wasn't just a location, it was a system, a process. Researchers arrive, discover anomalies, attempt to leave, and eventually become part of the island's ecology. Then new researchers are drawn in, and the cycle continues. Henderson wasn't just stranded here. He had become a component of whatever this place truly was. I grabbed my most essential documentation and fled into the jungle, away from the approaching boat. If the new team landed, they would become trapped as well. I had to warn them off, find a way to break the cycle. The path to the island's central volcano appeared before me, illuminated by bioluminescent plants that hadn't been there hours earlier. As I climbed higher, I began to see the island as a whole, not just physically, but temporally. From this vantage point, I could perceive multiple versions of the same locations, overlaid like transparent layers. Research stations from different eras existed simultaneously. Teams from various decades worked unknowingly alongside each other, separated by thin membranes of warped reality. At the volcano's rim, I found what appeared to be a control station built into the rock, technology far beyond anything human, disguised with organic components that blended with the natural environment. Henderson was there, but changed parts of his body now merged with the island's unusual biology, his eyes reflecting the same shifting patterns I'd seen in the tidal pool. "You understand now," he said, his voice resonating from multiple sources around us. "This isn't an island. It's a research outpost, just not one built by humans." The structure we were standing on began to move subtly, and I realized with horror that the dormant volcano was never a volcano at all. The entire island was part of something alive, something that had been collecting and assimilating human researchers for centuries, extracting their knowledge and experiences. They're interested in how we adapt, how we respond to anomalies, Henderson explained, gesturing toward the approaching boat with limbs that were now partially translucent. "Every expedition brings new information. They keep us as specimens, as part of their collection. Below us, I could see the new research team preparing to land despite the storm. In a moment of desperate clarity, I grabbed a strange communication. Device Henderson had been using and broadcast a warning using the satellite phone's frequency. My voice carried across the water, distorted but intelligible. Do not land. The island is not what it seems. Return to the mainland and quarantine all research from this location. The boat hesitated, hovering offshore. For a brief, hopeful moment, I thought they might heed the warning. Then I saw another figure on the beach, a perfect copy of myself, waving the team in, signaling that it was safe to land. Henderson's partially transformed hand gripped my shoulder. "You can't stop it," he said, his voice no longer entirely human. "This is how it always happens. Some version of you warns them away, while another version welcomes them. The process requires both." I watched in helpless horror as several members of the team began lowering a smaller boat, preparing to come ashore. As they did, something massive shifted beneath the island's surface. The volcano, or whatever it truly was, began to awaken. Henderson's expression was almost sympathetic as the structure around us pulsed with bioluminescent light. "The transition is beginning," he said. "Soon you'll understand your role here. We all do, eventually." The storm intensified as the smaller boat fought its way toward shore. Lightning revealed the true nature of the beach. Not sand, but something. Organic and responsive, reshaping itself to receive the newcomers. And walking toward the water's edge, my doppelganger turned to look up at me, its face splitting into a smile that contained too many teeth. I had one last chance to break the cycle, to save my colleagues and maybe myself. I lunged for the alien control panel, determined to find some way to disrupt whatever was happening. Henderson moved to stop me, but he was caught between human instinct and his new nature. Part of him still wanted escape, even after all this time. The island trembled beneath us as I made contact with the living technology, my hands sinking into surfaces that should have been solid. Information flooded my consciousness, incomprehensible at first, then resolving into patterns I could almost recognize. This wasn't just a research station. It was a node in something far larger, a network spanning distances I couldn't comprehend. And somewhere across that impossible network, something had noticed my interference. Something was coming. The sea began to recede around the island as if drawing back for a massive wave. The sky darkened beyond what any natural storm could cause. My doppelganger on the beach turned its face upward, its features now melting and reshaping into something that only approximated humanity. Henderson grabbed my arm with what remained of his human hand. His voice was urgent, clearer than it had been before. "You've triggered a reset," he said, his eyes momentarily lucid. "It's not supposed to happen this way. Run." I pulled away from the control panel, my hands now glowing with the same bioluminescence that pulsed throughout the structure. Henderson pushed me toward a passage that hadn't been visible before, a way down through the interior of the false volcano. "Find the original station," he gasped, his form becoming less distinct as the island continued to convulse. "The first one, from 1879. The logs contain the shutdown sequence. It was designed as a failsafe." The ground split beneath us as I ran for the passage. The last I saw of Henderson, he was being absorbed into the structure, his features peaceful. Despite the destruction around him, he had found a way to help after all, to momentarily break free from whatever had claimed him. The passage descended through impossible spaces, rooms that couldn't physically fit within the island's dimensions, laboratories filled with specimens both human and unidentifiable. I passed versions of myself at different stages of transformation, some barely recognizable, others terrifyingly intact but with eyes that reflected different realities. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in what appeared to be the original Research Station, Victorian in design, constructed of materials that might have belonged to a 19th century expedition. Maps on the walls showed the island as it had first been encountered, before whatever lurked here had fully awakened. A leather-bound journal lay open on a desk, its pages covered in urgent handwriting. The final entry caught my eye. The entity can be forced back into dormancy, but the price is high. Someone must remain to maintain the boundary. May God forgive us for what we've done by coming here. Below this was a sequence of symbols, the same ones I'd seen carved into driftwood and written in the sand. Not a language, but a code, a key to accessing the island's true nature. Outside, the island continued to tear itself apart as the reset sequence Henderson had mentioned progressed. Through a window, I could see my research vessel now caught in the turbulence. My colleagues fighting to retreat from the shore as the beach reached out with tendrils to ensnare them. My doppelganger was gone, but others had taken its place, versions of the researchers from different times, all partially transformed, all moving with unified purpose. I knew then what I had to do. The journal described a process, not an escape, but a containment procedure. Someone had to remain behind, become the anchor that would bind the entity to dormancy until the next cycle. The price of saving my colleagues was becoming part of the island myself, consciously and willingly as I began the ritual described in the journal. Tracing the symbols with fingers that now glowed from within, I felt the island's awareness turn toward me, curious, then alarmed, then furious. The structure around me fought against what I was doing, walls warping and tools animating themselves to interfere. Fear. I completed the final symbol just as the entity made its move. The false volcano erupted not with lava, but with something like liquid reality, a substance that flowed against gravity and distorted everything it touched. The sky above the island tore open, revealing a space beyond that human eyes were never meant to perceive. In that moment, as the reset reached its climax, I understood what Blackrock Island truly was, not an island at all, but a thin place, a membrane between our world and something else. The researchers it had collected over centuries weren't just specimens. They were components of a living dimensional gateway. And now I was joining them. The last thing I saw before consciousness transformed, with my research vessel successfully pulling away, carrying my confused but living colleagues back to the world I once knew. The island began to reshape itself, the damage repairing as reality stabilized. The gateway was closing, the entity retreating. I felt my awareness expand and divide, becoming part of the island's ecosystem in a way I couldn't have imagined. Past, present, and future existed simultaneously. I was now in many places at once, in the jungle watching new arrivals, in the old research station maintaining the boundary, on the beach welcoming the next expedition that would inevitably come. Each version of me served a purpose in the entity's design, yet each also contained the spark of resistance that Henderson had passed to me. The cycle would continue, but something had changed. Knowledge had been preserved. A new pattern had entered the sequence. And somewhere within the collective consciousness that now included me, a plan was forming, not for escape, but for communication. A warning to those who would follow. As the island settled into its new configuration, I felt my fragmented awareness resolve into a new kind of existence. I was still myself, but I was also part of something vaster, and somewhere across the dimensional boundary, beyond the gateway I was now helping to maintain. The entity watched with alien curiosity, studying, learning, and waiting for the next phase of its endless research. The ocean calmed around Blackrock Island, waves once again lapping gently at shores that appeared pristine and uninhabited. The jungle grew lush and inviting. The volcano stood dormant once more. All evidence of catastrophe vanished as the reset completed itself. But in the sand, new symbols began to form, A message left by whatever remained of the researcher who had come to study the island and had instead become part of its mystery. I am still here. We are all still here. And we will find a way to warn you when you come.